Hello, I'm James Arroyo, and this is Chapter 1 Communication Essential Human Behavior. I know what you're thinking. I already know how to communicate. Hello, my name is James. How are you? So, why is it important for me to learn about communication further? Well, there are many reasons as to why. First, it is the number one sought after job skill in the workforce today. We have to be able to not only communicate with the customer, but also with other businesses and even within those businesses. You are going to find situations where you are put into groups. And as a result, when we learn how to communicate better, we will be able to work better in those groups. And as a result, we will be more impactful in our future careers. Also, it affects how we are perceived because if we communicate in an ineffective way, then we are going to be perceived negatively and vice versa. But also how we perceive others. We have to be able to understand where our perception is faulty so that we are not judging people unduly. It also affects every interpersonal relationship. What is one of the biggest challenges in romantic relationships? Listening and conflict resolution. But sometimes that usually breaks down to that I do not feel listened to. So we are going to be able to improve these skills and therefore improve our relationships, make them more fulfilling, and make them last longer. Not just romantic, but all sorts of relationships. Also, we can change situations that we thought were permanent. Are there people around you that you just don't get along with? Me too. Who could have ever imagined? In this class, we will learn to try to find ways to communicate better with these people and as a result, develop more productive relationships with them. So, communication is the process by which we use symbols, signs, and behavior to exchange information. But what about words? Words are symbols. Every single word is a sort of symbol. Also, signs and behaviors, all to exchange information. We'll get further into what communication is, but let's also first talk about our goals for today. First, we're going to be discussing why we communicate. Then we'll be able to demonstrate effective communication, aka what it means to have effective communication, and also to visualize the communication process in a way that we will be better able to see what's going on in the moment. Why do we communicate? First, it helps us accomplish our goals. Guess what? Communication is very goal oriented. But there are three basic goals to communication and to being human: expressing affiliation with others, showing that you are connected with them, manage relationships, not just develop, but also to show maybe that there isn't a relationship there, and also to influence others. And this speaks a lot about control. First, we talk about expressing affiliation. Affiliation is a feeling of connectedness we have with others. This can be expressed verbally, non-verbally, through face-to-face, or mediated, aka texting or online channels. What are some of the ways that we show that we are affiliated online? Oh, I can tell you. We may be Facebook friends. We may be romantic relationships on Facebook or whatever social media platform. You could also post with other people, therefore showing that feeling of connectedness. Also, you could show that you like other people's photos. Oh, wow, we're connected now. Obviously, it's not as big of a deal, but we also show that through smiling, shaking hands, hugging, kissing, all of those things we use to express a connection with others. But we also manage relationships. Relationships are the interconnectedness between two people relationships are interdependent, meaning that what they do affects you, but also what you do affects them. So also, it is more than affiliation, because affiliation is simply the action of showing connection, whereas relationships are that interconnection. Hopefully, when we do show enough affiliation, we will eventually form into these relationships, but it does not always mean that. We have relationships with all sorts of people. Every single person, well, most people. Anyway, we also have influencing others. This involves control. Control is the ability of one person, group, organization to influence others and the way in which their interactions are conducted. So let's break that down a little bit. First, it is influence, not just forcing someone to do something, but that is so just because you are not forcing someone to do something doesn't mean that you do not have some control over them. Also, the way that their interactions are conducted. A lot of times, there are a lot of disadvantaged groups throughout our culture have had less ability to communicate their ideas, and as a result, were controlled in many different ways. With the advent of social media, this is actually changing. One of the small benefits of one of the big benefits of social media, I should say. But control is finite, meaning that, and it is determined within communication. So, for example, have you ever been strolling around the strolling around the Walmart or Target or whatever, and there is a child crying, "I want candy, I want candy." If the parent says no, who has control in this relationship? The parent. Then, if the child continues and continues, and the parent finally says, "Fine, you can have the candy," who has control in this relationship? The child. So control and influence is managed through this communication. So there are 6 big ways that we communicate. First, we have to understand the extent to which the message is symbolic, the code is shared, the degree to which the message is culturally bound, the sender's perceived intentionality, the presence of a channel, and the degree to which encoding and decoding of messages are transactional. I know what you're thinking. What did I just say? We're going to break down into this stuff. First, the degree to which the message is symbolic. Symbols are arbitrary constructions, usually language or behaviors that refer to objects, people, things, and ideas. No thing out there in the world has no word that we ever say is any different from any other word. They are all simply vibrations hitting air physically. But it is the symbolic meaning which we place onto these words, onto these behaviors, that gives it meaning. Does it mean that it doesn't have meaning? No, it absolutely does. If I go around, holding up the fingers right next to these two uh, and just walking around, are people going to rightfully be a little bit hesitant to engage in communication with me? Absolutely, because this has a symbolic meaning. Same thing with doves. Doves could mean freedom or equality or love, but it could also just mean a dove. So it can be as symbolic as freedom, love, peace, but it could also be as not as symbolic and just be a bird, a white bird. That does not mean that this is not symbolic. It just means that it is less symbolic. Also, these meanings are fluid and can change from person to person. What are some of the thoughts you have about what a rose means symbolically? Could mean love, romance? What about someone who works in a flower shop? They could even not just think maybe um, money, maybe even have a technical term for it. And when we have those technical terms, it shapes the way we view the world, but I will save that for another time. Could also mean also could mean pain, because when you handle roses, that you could potentially feel that sort of pain. So these symbols change from person to person. A bullwhip, for example, could mean adventure to me because I love Indiana Jones, or it could mean something else to other people. The extent to which the code is shared, the code is a set of symbols that are joined to create meaningful messages. So we have so we have language. English is a code that all of these symbols, hi, my name is James, how are you? That code is English. And all of those symbols are within the code of English. So we encode messages, the process of mentally constructing the message, putting it into symbols which can then be sent to someone. But then also it is someone else needs to decode that information, interpreting these and assigning meaning to a message that gets received. So there are both parts of these that are highly valuable, but we can even get more. But this is not necessarily exclusive to language. We have radio codes 10.9, 5.4, 10.21. All of these things have specific meaning in the code of radio speak. In the same way, you may have a job where you have language that is specific to your task, just like how we learned the code for mathematics, science, English. We also have the degree to which the message is culturally bound. Culture is the shared beliefs, values, and practices of a group of people. So the beliefs could be this is real, this is fake. The values are this is right, this is wrong. And practices are here's what you should do, here's what you shouldn't do. This can be drastically different across multiple cultures. For example, our culture, rightfully so, I like to think, thinks that infanticide, killing of babies, is wrong. However, back in Spartan era, they committed infanticide and it was totally fine. So this does not mean that that was right, but it just means that those beliefs can be culturally bound. But they could also not be culturally bound if the culture is not salient. That is why we are able to communicate with people across cultures. I love this example where the woman on the left says everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture, whereas the person in the hijab, I believe, says nothing covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. So they can have exactly the same meaning of completely different behaviors. We also have co-cultures, smaller groups of people within a larger culture that are distinguished by race, religion, age, generation, political affiliation, interests, hobbies, and far too many more to count. You could for example, what's the difference between a Raider fan culturally versus a Patriot fan culturally? Exactly. The Raiders are a organization that is built off of success, whereas the Patriots are designed to cheat. Moving forward, senders' perceived intentionality. Some information is given, some is just given off. Some information is intentional, some information is spontaneous, and it is not just based on what I intend to send, but also what the audience perceives of what I sent. For example, if I blush, it could be because, oh, I'm super shy, or it could just mean that I just ran. If some person who's sitting right next to you accidentally brushes their leg next to yours, does it automatically show that they like you? Absolutely. No, absolutely not. And we have to understand that, it's not entirely intentional. Also, if you are next to someone who is honking all for like 5 minutes, the first few honks you may think very intentional, whereas if someone then is continuing to do it, maybe their horn could potentially be broken. We also have the presence of a channel, and this is one that we tend to use poorly. There are some things that are not best communicated through a channel. Breaking up with someone, not a good idea to do through text. Also, in the same way, have you ever had an argument through text? How did that go? Not well, so weird. Of course, because we lose some of the nonverbal communication, and as a result, it changes the meaning of the message. We also have the degree that encoding and decoding of messages are transactional. Have you ever had a time that you thought, why did I say that? Some examples of this could be whenever you walk into a movie theater, hey, you enjoy the show, thanks, you too. That one's a little bit awkward. Also, there are a lot of times where we feel like maybe we should have taken something back, but it is transactional, meaning that it is transactional processes involve people exchanging messages as a sender and a receiver. Their messages are interdependent, meaning that what one person does affects the other, and what the other person does affects them. But also irreversible, meaning that I am not able to change the meaning of what was sent after the fact. There are some that are transactional, that are not transactional. If you are on Facebook and you're just posting about, oh my gosh, I am about to change the world with this one Facebook post that is going to just fundamentally change everyone's perspectives about a certain problem. And then you send it, you wait 2 seconds, and you're like, wait, that may not be the best thing to send. Delete, no, irreversible. That is reversible. Whereas if I spout off about some political belief that, may be very inflammatory, and I hurt someone, or I say something that is hurtful to someone else, then that is irreversible and is reflective of this interdependence, that I have hurt this person by what I have said. So, to recap, symbolic, the code has to be shared in some way. That can lead to some miscommunication if it's not. It's whether or not it's culturally bound, the intentionality of the message, the channel by which the message is sent, and transactional encoding and decoding, all of which can shape the meaning of our communication. So, with all of this information, can communication sometimes be challenging? Absolutely, because we have so much diverse information that it may be hard to focus this information into what I actually mean. But we try to coordinate our meanings. Usually, people do not, in regular communication situations, try to change the meaning that you intended. They're trying to get the meaning that you intended. So it is a co-created it is a co-created process of communication that we are both working to achieve meaning across both of our perspectives. What it means to communicate well. So we've talked about what communication is in general. Now we're going to talk about how to communicate well, and this leads into competent communication, which is communication that is effective and appropriate, meaning that I get what I want, but also it is appropriate to the given situation, in which the communicators evaluate and reassess their own communication processes. So I'm going to really quickly break down that last part in which communicators evaluate. So I have to look back and see how did I communicate and then reassess how I could communicate better. That is an important part because communication should be process oriented. It is about the process, it is not about the outcome. Striving to create mutually satisfying outcomes is the best way to maintain a process orientation. Because if you are trying to um, find a mutually satisfying outcome, you are showing that you care. You are showing a regard for the other person. And as a result, they feel like they are not just a passive observer of this communication situation, but they are an active participant of this process. It is dependent on ethics, the moral choices individuals make in their relationships with others. Guess what? There are some relationships where one person may hold a ton of the power and the other person may not hold as much of the power. And as a result, that can be a little bit challenging in regards to that process orientation, because if the person of higher power just always overrides the person of lower power, that could um, not be this process orientation. For example, if this person just steals candy from a baby, was that effective? Absolutely, he got the candy, but is it process orientation? Not exactly. Also, personal and cultural values are a guide to how to construct your messages appropriately. In other words, our culture shapes our ethics and our values, so to make our communication process oriented means to act ethically in a communication situation and not try to be deceitful or override the person or yell at the person or anything like that. Communication is also appropriate. What does it mean to be appropriate? Funny enough, it is actually about the culture, how well we adapt to our culture, because we have values, beliefs, and behaviors. And if we do not meet those cultural expectations, then that is deemed as inappropriate. Also, are there any drawbacks to being appropriate in political discourse? We can look to see how this is playing out now in not just the 2020 election, but in other elections. There may be some, but in general, appropriate communication is going to be far more effective than inappropriate communication in political discourse as well as in relationship building. How do we be appropriate? Through behavioral flexibility, to the ability to use a number of different behaviors depending on the given situation. In a church, I am going to act a different way than if I were at a party. Even 10 years ago, what was deemed as appropriate then, it may not be appropriate now. So we have to continue to try to change our behaviors and try to be as behaviorally flexible as possible so that we are maintaining this appropriateness. This does not mean to just change everything about yourself. That's going to the opposite end of the spectrum in a negative way. Instead, we want to be able to be flexible and be appropriate while still being ourselves. I'm sure that you all know someone who is, well, I'm just going to be me, and therefore acts in inappropriate ways. Also, competent communication is effective, meaning that you must help. Effective communication must help you meet your goals. So you must actually achieve what you set out to do in that communication situation. Keep in mind, focus on the goals and on your goals as well as the partner goals, because that maintains a process orientation. Also, keep in mind the partner's expectations of the communication situation. If you are not meeting the expectations of that partner, then that can lead to ineffective communication. I'll give you an example. If you communicate in a way that is maybe less respectful of a romantic partner, when their expectation, rightfully so, would be that, hey, I should be treated with respect, then one of the big goals of that communication situation would be to improve the relationship, um, develop love, and because that expectation of the partner was not met, then that can make that situation less effective. But that also could mean, I mean, I'm sure that we've all been with friends where we can be a little bit rude with each other and still show that affiliation and build that relationship, because with a romantic partner, being rude and crass may not be effective because of their expectations, whereas for certain friend groups, that may be exactly the expectation. And if you acted in a way outside of that, then that would be ineffective as well. Also, find how performance can grow when things don't go well. What is the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Have there been times when you have had ineffective communication with a specific person? This may be with a family member. This may be with a romantic partner. This may be with uh, a friend, maybe even with a boss. So if you are trying to if your communication does not work with achieving your goals, then you should try something else and therefore learn from that situation and improve your performance moving forward. It also involves communication skills. This is pretty obvious. It's kind of a coverall, but it is still worth mentioning. Communication skills are behavioral abilities based on social understandings that are used to achieve particular goals. Most incompetent communicators actually find themselves quite skilled. A big reason for that is because communication is not just talking, it is also listening. And when people are unable to listen or are unable to self reflect, then they could very easily see themselves as incredibly competent. And when they get that feedback of, no, that's not competent at all, that's not competent at all, then then I may not take in that feedback and therefore still see myself as quite skilled. But communication skills can be those people who are really funny, those people who can communicate very well, those people who are very insightful. They show wisdom. Those people you'd like to communicate with more. So these are skills that can be developed. It does not mean that if we do not have them now, we will never be able to develop them. Like any skill, communication can be developed. And competent communication involves technology. Communication has been affected by technology in a in an amazing amount of ways. But and we can argue as to whether or not that's good or bad. There have been good parts, there have been bad parts, but it has been fundamentally changed by technology. And if we do not adapt to this new reality, then we will be less competent in our communication through technology or otherwise. Technology channels can change others' perceptions of your communication competence. There may be people who do not text you for days after you've responded. On the flip side, there may be someone who texts you immediately and then texts you like five separate texts to one question. Both of those can show a lack of competent communication. Also, research, not to mention the over disclosure on social media. Research shows that if you are comfortable with a particular technology, you will see yourself as more competent and that with that technology, and therefore use it more to accomplish your goals. For example, if you feel like you're very competent with text, you will use that technology more often than if you felt less competent in it. This also means that if I do not feel competent, then that could lead to a destructive cycle of I don't feel confident, therefore I won't use it, therefore I feel less confident when I do have to use it, therefore I feel less confident, and therefore I will use it less. So, what are some of the rules of competent communication in technology? We'll find out. Now we will move on to modeling communication. Why is it that we need models for it? Because it is infinitely complex. And if we do not have models, we will be less likely to be able to observe and to understand certain parts of the communication situation so that we will then be able to improve our communication. So there are a few key terms that I want to discuss before we jump in. Sender is the person who sends the message. The receiver is the person who receives the message, which can sometimes be distorted. There is noise. This is interference, which can distort the message. So between the sender and receiver, the distortion that is created by noise. The message are communication with words or actions. So not just verbal, the words that we say, but nonverbal as well, the behavior, how we say the words. And we also have feedback. This is the message from the receiver to the sender that illustrates how the receiver is responding. For example, so at first, back in the day when dinosaurs roamed the earth, we had the linear model of communication, where a sender sends a message through a channel, the channel being face-to-face, or through TV, or through radio, or through social media, whatever channel, a message was sent out, and then there were distortions, because there's always going to be some sort of distortion, and then the receivers receive it. This is obviously a limited model of communication because it leaves a lot out. We also have the interaction model of communication. This is where not just the sender is sending a message through the channel, encoding a message through putting a bunch of symbols together within a code. Then the person is receiving that message, decoding it. There's a channel, there's a message, there's noise, but there's also feedback, meaning that the person is saying, how am I responding to this? Now we get into the best one, the competent model of communication. This has a lot more. So the person sends a message through the channel to the other person. They decode that message and then experience cognitions. Cognitions are what we think about the message, but also involves our self-esteem, our self-concept, and our self-efficacy. Think about it this way. Are we going to are we going to get something different out of the communication situation if the other person has much more power than me? In other words, my self-concept is here versus their versus where I see them is a lot higher. That's obviously going to change the way I decode the message. But then I prepare to send a message the other way. This is where I start encoding, but in the same way, I'm also giving feedback. I'm going, aha, if I understood, or huh, as in I don't understand. Then I send another message and then they decode and it goes through that. The things that are missing are the relational context, the situational context, and the cultural context, which I will jump into later. But cognitions are the thoughts communicators have about themselves, including their understanding and awareness of self-concept, self-esteem, and self-efficacy. Cognitions are can influence the communicator and the person who's listening as well, as we described. Behavior is the observable communication, including verbal and nonverbal communication. And to go through this entire process, we are not going, okay, now I have to encode my message. Hello, my name is James. How are you? I then send that to the channel. Okay, now as I'm sending that message, now she's starting to send feedback. Oh my gosh, I'm now trying to perceive that, and while I'm also trying to come up with another message. And no, of course not. We have cognitive complexity where we are able to consider multiple scenarios, formulate multiple theories, and make multiple interpretations when encoding and decoding of messages. For example, if someone says, hey, how you doing? That can have multiple meanings. It could mean friendly, it could mean flirtatious, it could mean how are you doing? More aggressive. So we have to be able to understand and formulate multiple theories of what that means, and then we narrow it down on the correct one. We try to coordinate our meaning with the other person. Now we move on to the types of context, and context is everything. It shapes a lot of the meaning behind what we are saying and what we are listening to. Relational history is the sum of shared experiences or the individuals involved in the relationship. This can affect what may or may not be appropriate in this context. For example, these two, they're hugging. Aw, super nice. But what if that person did not know that other person? Then it would be it would be a lot more awkward. So relational context is everything, because while a hug can be very meaningless and maybe be very friendly, it can also be perceived as flirtatious, and as a result, someone may not want that hug. This is actually where a lot of the challenge that people have in regards to sexual harassment situations, that one person wants either thinks that there is a relationship there or wants there to be a relationship there, and the other person doesn't. And as a result, the behavior's meaning changes, and therefore there is a challenge here. The expectations of goals of the relationship can also affect the communication, because we expect certain behavior from a romantic partner. We also expect certain behaviors of a friend, of a professor, of a student. This is our relational context, and we will be professional. We also have the situational context, the situation in which we are in. This includes the social environment, so either it's a loud party versus an intimate dinner, the physical place, a library versus a sports stadium would change our behavior, specific events, a wedding we would act a lot differently than if we were at a funeral. And even the specific mediated place, text versus tweet versus Zoom, all of which can change the meaning as well. So there are so the situation can very much change the meaning of what I say. That is why it is very important that we self-reflect and notice when we are not engaging in where our message is not communicating what we want to communicate in these situations. And then lastly, we have cultural context. Culture influences which of our messages are considered to be appropriate and effective, and strongly affects our cognitions about ourselves as well as how we relate to other people. So one of the through lines across everything that we discuss in this class, is going to be that culture shapes everything. Culture shapes every behavior that we make, every thought we have, every interaction we have. It is always bound within culture. There are things that are more culturally bound versus other things that are maybe less culturally bound, but everything is within the culture. Cultural identity, or how individuals view themselves as a member of a specific culture, also affects the communication choices they make and how they interpret messages they receive from others. There are people in our culture who are a lot higher on the cultural identity ladder than us. One example could be me in this communication situation. I have a lot more power than you do. Sorry. And as a result, it's going to shape how, not just how I communicate with you, but also how you communicate with me. But me versus communicating with someone else out there in the world, that cultural identity may shift slightly because we are not in this situation. Very interesting to note. That concludes chapter 1. Have a great day.